My research was called Sex Edutainment, and I called it also the familiar and the strange, because in sociology you have C. Wright Mill's book where he looks at everything we see in everyday life is the familiar, but we as sociologists look for the strange within it. So I chose to use the Netflix series Sex Education to look at how the young people are thinking about sex, talking about sex, and having sex. And I zoned in on how gender and sexuality were represented in the show and looking to see if the experience was an equal experience for both sexes. As Germaine Greer says, puberty is hell for boys and hell for girls. The academic research I used in my analysis was from Tom Inglis, and I call it her story, his story, because in Ireland, we were actually repressed by the church sexually. We allowed them to control our sexuality. And mothers actually enabled that. And, you know, we all have heard of that expression, the Irish mother, but they actually enabled and maintained how the church wanted us to perform. His second piece of research that I looked at was his Lessons in Irish Sexuality, which took us through a history of sexuality in Ireland. And within that, you can actually see a shift in ideology. There was a religious sex education program brought in 1997 to Irish schools. And he did research into how parents felt about it, how teachers felt about it, and how the young people felt about it. And you can actually see a shift from the traditional ideology to a more libertarian in some of the conversations between the parents. And most importantly, I took from it how the young people back then asked for peer-led sex education because it would be in their language that they understood. Other sociologists and frameworks I looked at were around legislation. In Ireland, we've had the divorce referendum, we've had the equality referendum, we've had the gender recognition referendum and the abortion referendum, which is just showing how much we're moving forward in the acceptance of difference and other ideologies. I also used queer theory, which would have come about from a gay movement in reclaiming the word queer, that it couldn't be used in a negative sense towards LGBTQI++ community. And I also looked at performativity theory, which is we have a French sociologist, Michel Foucault, who discusses power and knowledge, and that someone is always the object and someone is always the subject. But Judith Butler took that to another level, as in when there's solidarity, we can move power from a repressive state to a productive one, which is like the reclaiming of the word queer. Here we have a queer matrix and a heterosexual matrix. The queer matrix is, we agree you have a body, you may perform an identity, and that, to simply explain, could be you might be pansexual, bisexual, gay, and then you have desires. So it's very fluid and very accepting of other and difference. Whereas the heterosexual matrix, you have a fixed sex. Upon culture builds a stable gender that determines your desire to the opposite sex, which is maintaining heterosexuality and how we're socialized to see that there's only male and female, man, woman. The conclusion of my academic research was that there was a repression in Irish sexuality. Mothers maintained that repression, but queer theory brought about how we are taught about sexuality through our socialization. And to explain socialization, our primary socialization is from home and from family, and our secondary would be school, our peers. And so they actually impact how we think about gender too. And another piece of research I used was Udell's ethnography in a London school, where she looked at how girls were more gendered through the school process than they were at home. And then performativity theory, how gender and sexuality are performed in the show. A very clear example of that for anybody who has seen the show, or I'll briefly go through it, is Eric obviously had to be heterosexual in the first few years of his life until he realized he could come out. And then he came out as a gay young man. But then he started exploring his identities, and then we see the drag side of his identity coming out, which, you know, just goes to show an example where my theory matched the program that I picked. So, are sexuality and gender rigid or fluid? In looking at this, my methodology was a thematic analysis, which allowed for themes to evolve as I looked at the show. The method I used was I watched the series and then I focused on the examples that would match with my frameworks that I used. Limitations, I think it's a phenomenal piece of media, and I had to restrain my own biases in my research. Ethics, I didn't have any conflicting ethics because the show was actually in the public domain and I wasn't using any participants in my research, so I actually didn't have to go for approval. Briefly, reflexivity. My background is in youth and community work, and I'm also a disability advocate. And, you know, young people today are accessing sex education through school and home and through their peers, but they're also retorting to a new phenomenon, which is called sex edutainment, that they're looking up how to get educated about sex, sexuality, etc. via YouTube. Whereas I feel shows like Sex Education, Normal People, and It's a Sin will broaden understanding and experience in this challenging time of wondering who you are, your gender, your sex, and your sexual journey. So here we have on the left Eric, who was able to be fluid going through his process, even though he's from a very religious family. And on the right, we have Adam, who has to perform as a toxic male, yet is closet gay. And, you know, it's heartbreaking watching it. But here we have Eric in his full drag when he goes to the prom that night. So I used 3 themes to look at the show: gender and sex. And I proved that the experience of sex issues is actually equal for both. You go from non-virgin to virgin. Oh God, the other way around, sorry. Virgin to non-virgin. You have first-time sex, you have first-time same-sex, you have performance anxiety, and they're experienced equally in the show by both males and females. There's neither one dominated or the other. Sexuality and performativity can be fluid, as I've shown with Eric, and how he could actually flow and grow through his processes. And another thing I found interesting was there was opposing ideologies. There was traditional and libertarian in action in this show, and they worked together. So my findings: the sex issues are not impacted by gender. There was no male gaze, as in no oogling of how the girls looked or how the girls looked at the guys, or girl on girl, or guy on guy. There was no sexualization. If you actually start to take a step back, you'll actually see none of the clothing is actually sexualized. And even though it's a show all about sex, and gender is not naturalized in the show, as in we really don't see a rigid binary of male and female. They really, you know, are fluid to try and experiment who they are. And again, the coexistence of the ideologies. So I believe the show is a progressive, sex positive and realistic media product. And in today's society, we have new levels of sexual danger because of how sex has gone from a repressive state to an uncontrolled one, which is why I argue for more shows like this for audiences to see, because they consume and interpret and analyze what they see in media, and then they express their thoughts. So if we see a utopian society like I believe Sex Education portrays, where power is shared, people can be more reflexive about what they see and experience regarding sex, gender and sexuality, and be more informed. So this utopian society had no male gaze, no sexualization. Patriarchy was only present in the headmaster, and it really wasn't a dominant feature in the series. Church was Eric's family, went to church, and he was embraced for his sexuality. He wasn't repressed by that church. There's no stigma. You have Jackson's moms weren't, you know, ostracized when at parent-teacher meetings. There's such diversity in, you know, sexual representation and, you know, identities within the show, and just an amazing acceptance of difference portrayed in this wonderful series. So my conclusion: it's a well-balanced sex comedy, and educationally it covers taboo topics tactfully and sensitively. Future research would be to see in when COVID is gone, how people might feel about what I've seen, and does it back up what I've actually seen in the show. And also to highlight the need for how sex education can be more sex positive and in an inclusive of peer-led education, which is what young people probably are still looking for. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me, and if there's any questions.